The fire in the kitchen of Bramwell House had not caught properly since September. This was, by November, a known truth in every room of the building, though each inhabitant interpreted it differently. Mrs. Briggs, the cook, read it as a judgment upon the coal merchant, whose deliveries had grown thin and irregular with the thinning of the household's credit. Lady Bramwell, who occupied the principal bedroom above, and whose morning fire was laid by 6 o'clock, regardless of the coal's disposition, chose not to read it at all. And Emiline Kelmont, who was always the first person kneeling before it, understood it the way she understood most things in Bramwell House, as one of the conditions of her life, no different from blistered hands, from the sound of careful feet on floorboards in the small hours, from the particular cold that comes not from temperature alone, but from the knowledge that everything in one's care is slowly, quietly giving out. She had been working in houses since the age of 12. 31 years had taught her certain skills that no governess or finishing academy ever catalogued. How to carry a full tea tray without sound. How to leave a room so completely that the room itself seemed to forget she had been in it. How to hear, through closed doors and thin plaster, precisely what was said in voices that did not expect to be overheard. Emiline Kelmont was 43 years old, and she had perfected the art of being furniture. On this particular morning, the 4th of November 1817, with frost tracing its white script across the kitchen window glass, she was on her knees on cold flagstone in her grey wool dress, coaxing life from coal that still smelled of damp and obstinacy, when Mrs. Briggs arrived from the front hall, carrying the breakfast tray and wearing a look Emiline had learned to read the way sailors read a weather sky. "Let her come," Mrs. Briggs said. She set the tray on the deal table with unusual deliberateness, the deliberateness of a woman handling something that might detonate at pressure. Sealed with a crest, a duke's crest, if my eyes still serve me. Mrs. Briggs's eyes served her very well. She was 60, white-haired, with a face that had the permanent, weathered quality of old map leather, all planes and folded patience, the kind of face that has absorbed 3 decades of other people's catastrophes and emerged opinionated but not unkind. She had been cook over the course of her life in 3 separate households. All 3 had eventually closed. She did not speak of this often, but she had spoken of it once to Emiline, over weak tea at the kitchen table, well after midnight, in the particular tone of a woman offering testimony rather than conversation. 3 houses, she had said, and always the same music, furniture drawing together as rooms were shut, the word economy appearing where it had never been, the coal merchant growing unreliable. Bramwell House was deep into the movement she recognised as the 3rd act of that particular piece. The letter lay on the silver tray, a tray that Emiline had polished so faithfully for so many years that it wore a soft haze now, the surface thinning where the cloth had passed 1,000 mournings. The wax seal was dark blue, embossed with a coat of arms that any person in 3 counties could have named before the ink dried. The arms of the Duke of Stormhaven. Emiline carried it upstairs. Lady Bramwell, née Whitmore, had been beautiful at 20 and was handsome at 54 in the way that certain stones are handsome. Dense, hard-edged, having shed whatever warmth they once contained. She sat upright in bed with the letter on her knee and read it 3 times, each reading faster than the last. By the 3rd, she had gone completely still, with the particular stillness of a woman performing arithmetic that she does not want interrupted. "A masquerade," she said, not to Emiline, who stood at the washstand with the mourning cloth, to the window, where November rain moved sideways across the glass. "At Farfall, the first entertainment at Farfall in 6 years." She refolded the letter with 4 exact creases. "He has come out of mourning." A silence. "At last." The phrase "at last" was carrying considerable weight, and Emiline understood the whole of the ledger behind it without being invited to examine the figures. The Duke of Stormhaven had been a widower for 6 years. His estate stood 12 miles north. He possessed, by any county calculation, an income sufficient to rescue 2 families the size of the Bramwells, and still have enough remaining for a comfortable Tuesday. Lady Bramwell had a daughter, 19 years old, unmarried, and, Emiline knew this in the way that furniture knows everything, in desperate and private love with a curate named Mr. Adair, who had 2 years still to wait on his living. Sophie appeared in the doorway in her dressing gown, reading her mother's face with the accuracy of long practice. "No," she said, before Lady Bramwell had uttered a word. "You don't know what I—" "It is the Duke of Stormhaven, and the answer is no." The argument that followed occupied a quarter of an hour and produced nothing definitive. Emiline was sent out twice on small errands, water, then napkins from the press, and returned each time to a tableau that had shifted in position, but not in its essential geometry. Lady Bramwell constructed her case with the efficiency of a woman who has had to make very little serve for a very long time. The practicalities were named without the mortgages being named. The future was painted in colours that did not mention the alternative. The Duke was described in terms that reduced him to a pleasant evening's dancing. Sophie listened, and in the spaces between her mother's words, built something invisible and solid behind her eyes. Emiline found her that afternoon in the upper sitting room, on the floor beside the window seat, not dramatically, but simply, in the way bodies sit when performing the ordinary postures of the living seems like more effort than it is worth. Her back was against the window seat. Her face was turned toward the garden, where November had stripped the beds down to bare earth and stubble. She held in both hands a small packet of letters tied with brown string. Emiline set a cup of tea on the floor within reach and said nothing. "He wrote yesterday," Sophie said, after a long moment. "Mr. Adair. His patron has promised him a living, 2 years from now, if the promise holds." She looked at the cup, but did not take it. 2 years is not very long. "No," Emiline agreed, "it isn't. She would have me settled before Easter." Emiline looked at the garden, at the stripped beds and the grey afternoon sky above the wall. She thought of things she might say, that patience was possible, that circumstances shifted, that love had survived longer distances than 2 years. She said none of them. 31 years had taught her that silence offered in kindness was worth considerably more than words offered in comfort, and that knowing which to give was perhaps the one skill that could not be learned from a book. She stayed until Sophie had drunk the tea. Then she left her to the letters and the window and the emptied garden. That evening, Mrs. Briggs made a broth from a ham bone that had given broth twice already. It was thin and honest, and they ate it in the kitchen after the household was abed. The tallow candle between them burned down to the last finger of its length. The sound of the November wind finding the gap beneath the scullery door was the only other voice in the room. "She will want to send one of them," Mrs. Briggs said, into her bowl. Not specifying who, not needing to. "Sophie will not go willingly." "No." Mrs. Briggs set down her spoon. "Which means she will need another solution." The candle flame leaned east in the draught from the scullery door, a thin, persistent inclination, as though something on the far side was quietly calling to it. Emiline watched it for a moment and did not reply. Later, alone in her attic room 8 feet by 10, with a dormer window that admitted cold as freely as light, and a ceiling that sloped to meet the bed's headboard at an angle that had cost her 6 years of careful mornings, she opened the small drawer of the night table and took out the locket. It was silver, or had once been silver. One side wore a pale grey patina where her thumb had passed over it 10,000 times, working the surface to a softness the metal was never intended to acquire. The chain she rarely wore. She simply kept the locket in the drawer, the way one keeps things that cannot be thrown away and cannot be explained. The clasp had grown stiff with years. She worked it open with her thumbnail. The miniature inside was no larger than a shilling. A young man, perhaps 20, painted in the style of the previous century, in which all young men looked either solemn or slightly startled. This one looked solemn. His name had been Thomas Greer. He had been a solicitor's clerk in the first house where Emiline had worked, in the year she turned 19, before she understood that certain kinds of warmth were not for her. They had spoken in back stairwells and borrowed hallways. He had lent her books, actual books, carried in his coat pockets, with the corners turned down at passages he thought she should read. He had told her she was the cleverest person he had ever met, which she had understood even then as a statement about the breadth of his acquaintance rather than a judgment upon the world, but had loved him for it regardless. His family had intervened. Hers had not existed to do the same. She looked at the miniature for the span of 30 seconds. Then she closed the locket and pressed it, still closed, against her breastbone through the cloth of her dress. Held it flat there with one palm, the way a person holds a place that's still H when the weather turns. She was sitting that way when the floorboard outside the door gave its small, specific complaint. The loose board third from the hinge that she had been meaning to mention for 2 winters. And Mrs. Briggs appeared in the doorway in her nightcap, carrying no candle, wearing the expression of a woman who has come to say nothing in particular and intends every word of it. She did not ask. She crossed the room and sat at the end of the bed with the solid weight of a woman who has learned that most disasters are survived by staying near enough to another person that warmth remains possible, even in silence. She looked at Emiline's closed hand. Emiline looked at her. Then Mrs. Briggs reached out and pressed both of her old, flower-roughened hands over Emiline's. And that was all. They sat in the cold attic room while the wind worked at the tiles, and the candle that Mrs. Briggs had not brought burned nowhere. And the thing that needed to pass had time to pass. And then the cook rose and went back to her own room, and Emiline returned the locket to the drawer and lay down in the dark. 7 mornings later, Emiline was in the dining room cleaning the silver, the tray, the candlesticks, a set of soup spoons that had not been used in 2 years, but whose tarnish, untreated, would have been an accusation, when she became aware of Lady Bramwell in the doorway. She had not heard her come. She rarely did. Lady Bramwell moved in her own house with the quiet authority of ownership and did not announce herself to the furniture. The woman stood for a moment with her sharp, accounting eyes moving over the room. Then they settled on Emiline with a quality that had nothing to do with the silver. "Emiline," she said. "My lady." "How tall are you?" It was not, in its true nature, a question about height. Emiline set the candle snuffer down and turned, and in the brief silence between the question and whatever would come next, she read, in Lady Bramwell's measuring gaze, the way it travelled the line of her shoulder, the proportion of her figure, the grey and steadiness of her eyes, that what was being measured was not feet and inches. 5 feet and 4 inches, Emiline said. Which was the truth. The same as Sophie. Lady Bramwell held her gaze for one long, flat, ledger-closing moment. Then she gave a small, decisive nod and left the doorway without another word. Emiline stood in the cold dining room with the silver cloth still in her hands and heard very clearly what had not been said. The masquerade was 3 weeks distant. Sophie Bramwell would not go willingly into a duke's ballroom to be sold. But someone of the right height, the right silence, the right 31 years of practice at becoming whatever a room required, someone like that might go in her place. At Farfall, the great house blazing for the first time in 6 years, something was waking that had slept for longer than anyone in the county quite wished to count. And in the arithmetic Lady Bramwell was working, the only figure she had not yet accounted for was whether the woman who stood in for Sophie could do so without ceasing in the process to be furniture. Whether, in other words, she could be seen. 3 days passed before Lady Bramwell raised it directly. During those 3 days, Emiline continued her work. The fires, the silver, the carrying and the folding, and the invisible presences in doorways, and felt the shape of what was coming, the way old houses feel weather, through their joints, before the sky gives any sign. Sophie had gone quiet in the particular way of a person who has decided that speech costs more than it returns. Mrs. Briggs made her broths and said nothing. The letter from Stormhaven sat in Lady Bramwell's writing desk, its blue wax seal already broken, but its consequences sealed harder for the breaking. On the third morning, Emiline was summoned to the morning room. Lady Bramwell sat at the writing table, with no paper before her and both hands folded, a posture that belonged to negotiations, not correspondence. The fire here had caught, for once. The room held warmth as though in deliberate witness. "You will have understood," Lady Bramwell said without preamble, "what I am asking." "Yes, my lady." "Sophie will not go. She has made this clear in terms I found exhausting, and do not propose to revisit." The hands remained folded. The fingers were still. "You are the same height. Your carriage, when you are not performing your usual studied invisibility, is better than hers. You carry your head from the neck as she does not. And you have grey eyes, which at the distance of a ballroom and behind a mask are not materially different from blue." A pause with the quality of a calculation completing. "You will go in her place." Emiline said nothing for a moment. The fire spoke, brief and small. "You are asking me to deceive a duke," she said. "I am asking you to attend a masquerade in a mask, which is the stated purpose of a masquerade." Lady Bramwell permitted herself a thin, dry compression of the lips that was not quite a smile. "You will be seen. You will not be spoken to at length. Such events do not require it. You will leave before the unmasking and return before midnight. The whole exercise purchases time. In that time, Sophie may come to her senses, or Mr. Adair's living may be confirmed, or—" She stopped. She did not name the other possibilities, but they moved through the room like weather. "What I am not prepared to do is send Sophie into that house to make a scene that will end what remains of our position in this county." "And if I refuse?" The pause this time was shorter, and what it carried was not cruelty. Lady Bramwell did not deal in cruelty. She dealt in arithmetic. "You will be turned off, without a character." The simplicity of it was worse than any elaboration would have been. "You are 43 years old, Emiline. The road in winter is not kinder for the company of principle." This was accurate. It was accurate in the way that a very old stone wall is accurate, not because anyone has recently built it, but because it has stood so long that the landscape has arranged itself around it. Emiline knew the terms of her situation without needing them demonstrated. She had known them since she was 12. She knew what happened to women servants turned off without reference. She had, in 31 years, seen enough of the road's curriculum to have no desire to enroll. But she had also, in those 31 years, learned the thin difference between a door that closes and one that merely narrows. "One condition," she said. Lady Bramwell did not move, but her attention sharpened. She was not accustomed to conditions from servants, and the word arrived in the room at an unfamiliar angle. "Sophie's curate," Emiline said. "Mr. Adair. Whatever happens after, Whatever scheme or settlement or arrangement follows from the masquerade, you will not move against him. Not until the fortnight is finished. If I am doing this for the family's stability, the family will keep its part. No letters sent to his patron, no word whispered to the bishop, no interference. You are remarkably well informed about the bishop. I have been in this house 11 years, my lady. Another silence, the fire again. Lady Bramwell's gaze moved from Emiline's face to the window, and in the brief geography of that movement, Emiline read several things at once. The calculation, the small surprise, and beneath both of those, a more complicated current, the acknowledgement, quiet and unannounced, that the woman standing before her in grey wool was more than the sum of her function. "One fortnight," Lady Bramwell said. "The curate is left alone." She unfolded her hands. "And you will do exactly as instructed." "Yes, my lady." Emiline left the morning room with the shape of her future changed around her, and the expression of a woman carrying a full tray. The gown arrived 4 days before the masquerade, brought from a dressmaker in the market town 20 miles south, ordered under a false name and an explanation involving a cousin's sudden engagement. It was silver grey silk, not the flat grey of Emiline's work wool, but a silk that held light differently in every room. Now pewter, now the colour of still water, now almost white at the shoulder where the candlelight caught it. The neckline was decorous but not severe. The sleeves were long. The skirt was not fashionable by the standards of the present season, but it was close enough, and it moved with a sound, a small, private conversation of fabric against fabric that Emiline had never heard from anything she had worn in 43 years. The fitting happened in Sophie's room, with Sophie present, sitting on the window seat in her dressing gown, and wearing the expression of someone watching a play they have been told they cannot attend. "It fits better on you than it would on me," Sophie said after a long study. There was no bitterness in it, only the candour of a young woman who has abandoned pretense. "You stand differently in it." "You mean I stand as though expecting to be told to take it off?" Sophie almost smiled. "I mean you stand like someone who doesn't need to be looked at to exist." She drew her dressing gown closer, the movement of someone feeling a draught. "The Duke will notice." "The Duke will not know it is the maid." "No," Sophie said, "but he will notice the woman." The mask arrived in a separate packet, a grey domino of heavy silk, the edges worked with silver thread in a pattern of small knots, repeating, geometric, the kind of needlework that takes years and costs accordingly. It covered the brow to the lip, shaping the face into a fraction of itself. Eyes and mouth and the bare line of jaw, and the rest hidden. Emiline put it on before Sophie's dressing glass, and stood a moment looking at the woman who appeared there. She was not accustomed to mirrors. Her attic room had none, and she encountered her own face only accidentally, in silver trays, in the dark surface of the library windows at night, in the occasional glass of a house that had no reason to place mirrors in the servants' passage. What the dressing glass showed was therefore something like a stranger's evidence. The grey silk made her eyes look lighter than she knew them to be. Her hair, which was dark with broad threads of silver, had been dressed by Sophie's own unpractised hands into something that bore a reasonable resemblance to fashion. And the mask performed some alchemy that Emiline could not entirely account for. It removed the fixed quality of a known face, the legibility of a woman who could be read at a glance as belonging to a particular room and a particular function. The face in the glass belonged to no room at all. It was free of assignment. She studied it for perhaps 10 seconds, then she put the mask down on Sophie's dressing table and returned to her own room to make up the evening fire. Farfol. She had heard the name her entire adult life, as one hears the names of very old, very large things. Not as a destination, but as a feature of the landscape, fixed and permanent, a point on the county's inner map that oriented everything around it, the way high ground orients a valley. 12 miles north, 600 acres. The ducal seat of Stormhaven since the third Duke, who had built the East Wing in 1698 and died before the plasterwork dried. It had been dark for 6 years. She saw it first from the carriage, Lady Bramwell's carriage, shabby in its upholstery but serviceable, following the line of vehicles that moved slowly up the lime avenue toward the house at 9 o'clock in the evening. The limes were stripped by November, their branches against the sky like the crossed arms of a crowd. And at the end of them, Farfall burned, every window lit. The facade of pale stone, 4 stories and 7 bays across, throwing light into the avenue from 100 candle flames behind glass. The effect was not merely visual, there was heat in it, and sound, and something that arrived before either of those, through the carriage door, through Emiline's gloves, the sensation of a place that has just drawn its first real breath after a long-held silence. 6 years, Lady Bramwell said, and pressed her lips together. Whatever she had meant to add, she kept. They entered the great hall, marble floor, plasterwork ceiling, 3 footmen in full livery at the door, and Emiline felt the mask on her face with the same awareness with which one feels a borrowed garment, present at every point of contact. Around her, the guests of a county house party were arriving in clusters, shedding cloaks and handing cards, and exclaiming over the light, the warmth, the extraordinary fact of Farfall inhabited. Women in velvet and silk moved through the hall like painted birds suddenly released from a case. Men in black coats and white neckcloths formed temporary geometries near the fireplace and rearranged themselves as the footman directed. Emiline moved through it with the gravity of a person who has spent her entire life navigating rooms she was not central to. Lady Bramwell, by previous arrangement, separated from her at the ballroom door. The plan was simple and had been stated 3 times. Be seen by the Duke if possible. Speak to him if unavoidable. Say nothing that could not be said by a young woman of good family from the county. Leave before midnight. The plan had been designed for Sophie's particular style of misery. Small, well-mannered, contained. It had not been designed for Emiline. The ballroom was high-ceilinged and white, with pilasters of pale stone between the windows and a ceiling painted in the manner of an Italian sky, blue-grey, cloud-crossed, inhabited by plump allegorical figures whose Latin attributes were gilded at the corner. The musicians were placed, as the plan had noted, in the gallery that ran above the western wall. Emiline could see the pale gleam of their music stands through a screen of silk panels, and their sound came down changed, filtered, softened, as though the music had travelled some distance before it arrived. The smell of the room was beeswax and perfume, and beneath those, the coal fires burning in 3 enormous grates, and beneath even that, the specific smell of a house that has been opened after a long cold. The stone walls releasing something slow and mineral, the breath of a house taking inventory of itself. She found a pillar on the eastern wall, where the light was a shade cooler than at the centre of the room, and stood there. It was a skill she had. Not stillness exactly. Stillness drew attention eventually, in the way that any fixed object in a room of movement eventually snagged the eye. What she practiced was the near invisible motion of someone who belongs. The small shifts of weight, the appropriately vague attention directed toward the dancing, the angle of the head that suggested neither wallflower nor observer, but simply a person existing in their own correct place. She had practiced this at every dinner party and assembly and morning call of the last 31 years, always on the wrong side of the threshold, always carrying something, or straightening something, or waiting to be needed. She practiced it now, in silver-grey silk, and it worked as it always had. From her pillar, she could see most of the room. She could see Lady Bramwell, stationed near a dowager she knew slightly, her eyes cataloguing the crowd with a casually focused horror that Emmeline recognised from years of watching the household accounts read. She could see the musicians behind their silk screens, 3 violins, a cello, a harpsichord, and a young woman with a flute, who played rather better than the occasion seemed to require. She could see, in the far corner near the tall windows, an elderly woman of remarkable uprightness, seated in a gilt chair upholstered in faded yellow silk. The woman was 80 or older, in black, with white hair dressed high and a necklace of garnets that caught the light at every pulse of candle flame. She was not dancing. She was not talking. She was watching the room with an economy of movement that suggested she had been watching rooms for 6 decades and had long since stopped bothering with the pretense of doing anything else. This was Lady Eleanor of Voss. Emmeline would learn her name later, but she marked her now as a person trained by 30 years of domestic intelligence marks anyone who watches a room the way they themselves watch a room, with the careful attention of someone taking an inventory that may later matter. She was noting the old woman's position relative to the door when the Duke appeared at her pillar. He had not crossed the room to reach her, she had not seen him move. This was, she understood immediately, a skill of his own. He was perhaps 50, perhaps 48, a man in that decade of age where the lines of the face have settled into something more definitive than youth allows, but not yet into the softening of true old age. He was tall. He wore black, coat and breeches and cravat, and a black mask that covered him from brow to cheekbone, leaving visible a mouth with a particular quality of compression at the corners, and a jaw that had weathered the last 6 years the way old timber weathers, growing harder with each season rather than soft. His dark hair was touched with grey at the temples, worn without powder. He carried no drink, no card, no conversational prop of any kind. He stood at the pillar next to hers and looked at the dancing, and the single quality that marked him out from every other man in the room was the complete absence, in his posture, of any suggestion that he was having a good time. The occasion offered several safe observations: the excellence of the music, the surprising warmth of the evening, the particularly fine arrangements of the supper table, which Emmeline had observed on her way through the hall, and which would have served perfectly well as an opening gambit. She composed one, then put it aside. She considered the set of his shoulders, the particular angle at which he held his head in relation to the spectacle he was observing. And before she had made a decision in the ordinary sense of the word, she heard herself say, "You look like a man being measured for a coat he does not want to buy." The Duke turned. She did not, afterward, fully account for where the sentence had come from, only that it was the true sentence, the one she would have said if she had any right to say anything to him at all, and that there was something in the covering of her face that had granted her, temporarily, the permission she had never had for the truth. She held his gaze and felt the mask on her face with sudden gratitude. He studied her for a moment, with dark eyes that were doing a great deal of rapid and apparently unannounced thinking. Then something shifted, very small, very controlled, at one corner of his compressed mouth. "That," he said, "is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in a year." "You give it away," she said. "The hand with the wine glass. You hold it as though you were about to set it down and leave." "I have been about to set it down and leave since 9 o'clock. He was still looking at her with the sharp, slightly startled attention of a man whose view of the room has been unexpectedly rearranged. "Tell me, since you have evidently been watching me, is there anywhere in this room that does not require a certain performance to inhabit?" She considered the question seriously because it deserved serious consideration. "The gallery," she said, "where the musicians are. I imagine one could listen to a flute from behind a silk screen and have no expectations placed upon one at all. "I cannot," he said, with a bleak, almost private dryness, "excuse myself to the musicians' gallery. There are 100 people in this room who require proof that I have recovered from myself." "They will continue to require it regardless of where you stand," Emiline said. "The question is whether they require it from you or from some easier version of you that you would rather not be." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set down the glass on the ledge of the pillar beside him, not in preparation for departure, but in preparation for paying attention. They talked. She would not, later, be able to reconstruct the exact sequence of what was said. What she retained was the structure of it, the quality of exchange between two people who have both, independently, arrived at a similar latitude by entirely different routes and have not expected the company. They spoke of books. He had a library. She knew this from county knowledge. But she allowed him to discover that she had read, rather than telling him she had, and the discovery, when it came, changed the quality of his attention in a way she noted and did not acknowledge. They spoke of the county and the cold of it, the way the landscape in November lost all softness and revealed its real geometry. He asked her whether she found the country dull. She said she had found very little of life dull, but a great deal of it exhausting, which was different. And he gave a short, involuntary sound that was nearly a laugh. The first of the evening, from the sound of it. From a man for whom laughter had become slightly unusual. The dancing continued around them. The musicians behind the silk screen moved from a reel to something slower, a waltz, in 3/time, with a particular liquid weight to it. At some point the candles in the nearest chandelier burned lower, and the light between them grew warmer and closer. He asked her to dance. She gave him her hand. The floor was full. The waltz at that hour had drawn nearly every couple who intended to dance. They moved into the crowd and found their space within it, and he placed his hand at her waist with the precise, practiced courtesy of a man who has been taught since boyhood to make women comfortable. And she put her gloved hand on his shoulder, and they began. The 4 minutes of a waltz are not very long. This is known and is in fact the point. The measure of the dance is in its brevity, in what can and cannot be said in the time it takes the musicians to complete their arc. What Emiline noticed was his left hand, which held hers with a steadiness that was not the steadiness of indifference. It was the steadiness of attention. He danced as he had talked, with the quality of a man who is present, entirely and specifically in this exact place, which was not how most people danced. Most people danced with their bodies, while their minds rehearsed the next conversation, the next room, the next maneuver. He danced as though the dance were the only item of importance in the current century. When the waltz ended, he held her hand for a breath longer than convention required. She felt the held moment. 3 seconds, perhaps 4, and understood its grammar. Not as presumption, which it was not, but as the grammar of a man who has not been surprised in a very long time, and has not yet decided what to do with the surprise. Then she released her hand from his, not sharply, but cleanly, and thanked him, and moved back toward the eastern wall. She found a clock at 20 minutes to midnight, in the passage outside the ballroom. It was an old bracket clock, in a case of dark fruit wood, its face moon yellow in the hall light. The kind of clock that has stood in the same position for so long that the wall behind it has grown a faint square of slightly different colour. 11:40, it told her. Time, as the plan required, to go. She retrieved her cloak from the footman at the door before the unmasking bell, which she could hear, already, being rung somewhere in the depths of the house. A single, slow note of brass, with a particular, festive urgency. She descended the steps into the cold lime avenue without looking back. The carriage was there. The driver's name was Fenwick. He had been with the Bramwells 14 years and was owed 6 months of wages that Emiline doubted would arrive before spring. He looked at her. The silver-grey gown, the mask still in her hand, the cold coming off the night around her, and said nothing. Which was the particular mercy of a man who has driven a family long enough to understand that service sometimes requires the active renunciation of curiosity. The avenue behind her held the sound of the music for a long time as they drove. The musicians had moved to something faster now, an air for the unmasking, bright and rising. She sat with the grey mask on her knee, its silver thread catching the occasional light from a gate lantern as they passed. She did not open the locket. She held the mask, felt the cold silk of it under her fingertips, and said nothing. What she allowed herself to think was this: that the plan had worked. She had been seen as Lady Bramwell required. She understood this with the plain accuracy that she brought to all assessments. Unforgettable. In the 12 miles between Farfall and Bramwell House, in the dark of the carriage, she permitted herself the space of one single, honest acknowledgement, which was that in the 4 minutes of a waltz and the hour before it, she had experienced the weight of being wanted. Not as a function, not as a solution to a domestic inconvenience, but as the specific person she was, with grey eyes and an opinion about books, and a sentence produced without calculation. She permitted herself this acknowledgement for approximately 2 miles. Then she folded it away with the same careful practice she brought to the locket, and spent the rest of the journey thinking, instead, of what Lady Bramwell would say in the morning. What she did not yet know, could not know, riding south through November dark, while the unmasking bell faded behind her, was that in the great gilt chair at the corner of Farfall's ballroom, Lady Eleanora Voss had spent the last hour watching her nephew, with the specific attention of a woman who is watching a man discover something he has not expected. And that the old woman, when the unmasking came and the silver-grey woman was not among the unmasked, had noted the empty place on the ballroom floor with the expression of a problem whose first solution had just, interestingly, failed to present itself, and whose second solution might be, if she looked carefully, rather more interesting. The invitation arrived on the 12th of November, 5 days after the masquerade. Lady Bramwell received it in the morning room at 8:15 and read it standing up, which she did only with correspondence that required immediate action. Emiline, who had brought the post in from the hall on the silver tray, was directed to wait. She stood near the door in the posture she had cultivated across 3 decades, which was the posture of a woman so comprehensively unremarkable that the room might proceed without her. The Duke of Stormhaven requested the pleasure of the Bramwell family for a fortnight's stay at Farfall, commencing the 21st. The phrasing was courteous and specific. The intention was plain. He wished to further his acquaintance with Miss Sophie Bramwell, whose conversation at the masquerade he had found, as he put it in his careful hand, uncommonly refreshing. Lady Bramwell set the letter down on the writing table and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at Emiline. Emiline said nothing. The arithmetic was already complete. It had been complete, she suspected, since the moment the invitation had arrived. The complication was not difficult to name. The Duke had been charmed by a woman he had called Miss Bramwell, and who had not, in the relevant sense, been Miss Bramwell at all. His invitation was addressed to the family, but it was pointed, clearly, at a specific member of the family who had not been in his company for a single moment of the evening in question, and who would now be required to sustain, across a fortnight of close household acquaintance, a connection she had never made. "You will come as her maid," Lady Bramwell said. Emiline permitted herself one quiet breath. "And if he remembers me?" He danced with a masked woman for 4 minutes at an assembly. He will not remember a maid. Lady Bramwell picked up the letter again, as though the matter had been decided, which, by the logic of Bramwell House, it had. You will behave as you always behave. You will be invisible. Sophie, when told, sat for a long time on the edge of her bed, with her hands folded in her lap. She had the quality, in those days, of a young woman who has accepted a situation while continuing to find it profoundly insufficient. She said, finally, "I won't be unkind to him." "No," Emiline said, "you won't. I simply won't be able to make him like me. I don't know how to be whatever it was he found interesting." There was no good answer to this, because it was simply true. Emiline packed the trunk that afternoon. Sophie's dresses, Sophie's brushes, the pressed flowers Sophie kept between the pages of her Bible, the small stack of Mr. Adair's letters, wrapped in brown string, and buried at the bottom beneath 2 layers of folded petticoats. And at the very bottom of her own smaller box, beneath her second grey dress and her spare shift and the copy of Cowper's poems that Mrs. Briggs had given her 4 Christmases ago, she folded the grey domino mask and laid it flat. She closed the lid on it. She buckled the strap. She carried the box downstairs herself. Farfalla in the daylight was a different proposition from farfalla blazing at 9 o'clock at night. It was large in the way that places are large when they have not been attended to. The size felt less like grandeur and more like attrition, as though the space had expanded slightly in the absence of the people needed to make it comprehensible. The lime avenue, striking at night with its crossed winter branches, looked in the grey morning light merely long. The pale stone facade was beautiful, but still, in the way that beautiful things are still when they have been alone for a long time. 3 of the upper floor windows on the east wing had their shutters closed at noon. The kitchen garden, which Emiline passed while the carriages were being unloaded, had been dug over but not replanted, and the forcing house at its eastern end stood dark and empty, its glass panes cataracted with frost. The housekeeper met them at the servants' entrance, a woman named Mrs. Thornton, broad-shouldered and deliberate, with a ring of keys at her waist large enough to secure a small fortress. She had the air of someone who has been running a reduced household with diminished staff for 6 years, and has maintained standards through a combination of personal stubbornness and very early mornings. She showed Emiline to the servants' quarters, with the expressionless efficiency of a woman for whom new arrivals represented primarily new labour distributions, and then paused at the door to the linen closet and said, without turning, "The east wing is closed. It will remain closed. Mr. Harlan," the Duke's steward, "has given explicit instructions that no guest or attendant should enter the east corridor past the green baize door." "Understood," Emiline said. Mrs. Thornton turned then and looked at her, a brief, comprehensive assessment of the kind that housekeepers perform as automatically as other people breathe. What she found in Emiline's face apparently satisfied some private standard, because she gave a single nod and added, more quietly, "The house has not had a proper fire in the east drawing room since last winter. The grate smokes if the damper is not opened fully before the coals are laid." She paused. "I mention it because our footman, William, is reliable but inexperienced with the older fireplaces." "I'll see to it," Emiline said. Mrs. Thornton looked at her for a second longer, and something passed between them that was too brief and too practical to be called warmth, more like the recognition of 2 people who have come to the same country by different roads and find, with some relief, that they speak the same language. Within 3 days, Emiline had mapped Farfall the way she mapped every house, not with the eyes of a visitor, but with the eyes of a woman who would need to maintain it. She knew where the draughts entered the breakfast parlour, and she rearranged the 4 chairs in it so that 2 faced each other across the hearthrug, rather than being ranked against the wall in the manner of a waiting room. She did this in the early morning before the household assembled, and said nothing about it when the Duke's secretary, Mr. Poole, remarked at breakfast that the room felt more habitable. She found the library's south-facing windows shuttered at 8 in the morning and opened them, which allowed the pale November sun to arrive at the reading chairs for the 2 hours of the day it had the strength to be useful. She inquired of Mrs. Thornton about the names of her grandchildren. There were 4, ranging from 2 years old to 14, and used those names correctly twice in the first week, which caused Mrs. Thornton to regard her thereafter with a degree of cautious goodwill she extended to very few people. And she found Jeb. He was in the dovecote at the north end of the kitchen garden, a structure of weathered brick with a hexagonal lantern turret at the top, and the remains of 30 years of nesting in every interior cranny. He was perhaps 70, stopped like a tree that has grown in prevailing wind, with hands so large they seemed made for a heavier man. He spoke to no one. This was known below stairs, the way all things are known below stairs, as established fact, circulated without commentary. He had lost a son to the sea in the same year the Duchess had died, and grief had simplified him to his essentials, which were the doves and the silence required to tend them properly. The problem was the feed. Emmeline discovered it on her second morning. A sack of grain, 3/4 empty, in the lean-to behind the cote, with 6 weeks of winter still ahead. The nearest merchant who supplied the estate was 12 miles south. Jeb had not, as far as Mrs. Thornton knew, mentioned it to anyone. Emmeline spoke to Mrs. Thornton, and a 1/2 hundredweight of mixed grain was ordered from the merchant, without routing the request through the Duke's steward or anyone else who might cause the old man embarrassment. The sack appeared in the lean-to on the 4th day of the visit. Jeb did not acknowledge it. But the next morning, when Emmeline came to the kitchen garden at dawn, for no particular errand she would have been pressed to name, she found him at the cote door, scattering grain on the cold flagstones. And the doves, 12 of them, white and slate, and one the colour of old paper, moved from the stones to her outstretched hand, with the calm trust of creatures who have been recently reminded that the world intends them no harm. She stood quite still, with the birds on her hands and forearms, and was not aware of being observed. The dawn conversations began on the 5th morning. She had taken to sitting in the library at 6 o'clock, in the window chair with the pale sun on the page, with whatever volume she happened to take from the shelves. The library at Farfol was a room of serious intent, not a decorative library of matched bindings, but a working collection that had grown across several generations without anyone making it presentable. There were gaps where books had been removed and not replaced. There were pencil marks in margins. There was a smell of leather and paper and old tobacco, and faintly the mineral smell she had noticed in the ballroom, the particular signature of rooms that have been cold for a long time. On the 5th morning, she was 40 pages into a copy of Evelyn's Silver, a 1706 edition, the binding cracked at the spine, when the Duke came in. He stopped when he saw her. She stood, because that was what one did, and he said, with the slightly arrested quality of a man whose mourning has deviated from its expected course, "Please sit down." She sat. He poured himself coffee from the service Mrs. Thornton had left on the sideboard, a habit, it seemed, older than any servant's assistance, and settled into the chair at the other end of the hearth, and opened his own book, and said nothing for several minutes. Then he looked at the spine of hers. "Evelyn. The arboriculture," she said. "I found it in the section on household management, which seemed an unusual placement. My grandmother, she categorised by her own system." He looked at the shelves with a brief, unfocused attention that suggested the comment had come from somewhere he had not intended to visit. "She grew the walnut grove on the east slope, the one that looks like an accident of nature now." "Walnuts take 40 years to reach a proper canopy," Emmeline said. She would have planted them for people she expected never to meet. He looked at her. Not with surprise exactly, more with the quality of a man recalculating a distance. That is a precise way to think of it, he said. It is the only honest way. Most things people plant are for strangers. They sat. The fire, which she had laid herself before sitting down, and the damper opened fully, the coals placed so they would hold through the morning, gave a steady, settled heat. Outside the window, the November kitchen garden stood in its stripped geometry, bare earth, and the last of the green herbs gone to grey. He told her, eventually, that he had been away from Farfall for the better part of the last 3 years. Not in the letter-by-letter account one gives a stranger, but in the fragmentary way of a man, describing a weather pattern he has lived rather than observed. He had opened the house for the masquerade because Lady Eleanora had required it of him, in terms he had found difficult to decline. He was not, he said, certain the house had forgiven him for the interval. She looked at the shelves and the cold morning light on the cracked spines and the gap where something had been removed and not replaced. Houses are patient, she said. They hold their shape long after the people in them stop holding theirs. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You are not what I expected of—" He stopped himself. She understood why he had stopped. He had nearly said of a lady's maid, which would have been accurate and awkward, and he had caught it in time. She was grateful for the catch, because it spared both of them a reckoning they were not yet equipped to have. "I had a good teacher," she said, which was true of Mrs. Briggs and her midnight reading, and which sounded, in this context, like a benign deflection. He accepted it without pressing further. But he stayed until 7 o'clock, and he came back the following morning, and the morning after that. She found the letter on the 8th day. She was dusting the shelves of the small study off the east corridor, within the permitted zone, before the green baize door, when the corner of a folded paper caught the cloth and slid from behind the row of estate ledgers where it had been placed, apparently some years before, with the intention of being invisible. She caught it before it fell, and might have replaced it without looking, but the fold had opened slightly, and the first line was there before she chose it. "To the family of Eleanor Harcastle," he had written, in a hand she recognised from the ballroom invitation, careful, pressured at the downstrokes. "I am writing to you for the 3rd time, knowing as I write that I will not send it. What I wish to say cannot be said in a letter because it is not an apology, which a letter might carry, but an accounting, which requires a living witness." She stopped. She read no further. She refolded the paper along its original creases, which were worn soft with the specific quality of paper that has been folded and unfolded many times by the same hands, and replaced it behind the ledgers with the same angle and the same invisible positioning it had held before. She dusted the remainder of the shelf in careful silence. That afternoon, she walked to the kitchen garden, where the forcing house stood empty and cold. She had been wrong about it earlier. It was not entirely dead. At the back bench, where the heat from the boiler pipe still barely reached through the cracked masonry, 3 white roses had forced themselves into improbable late flower against a November that had no use for them. She cut one, short-stemmed and fully open, the petals already faintly translucent at the edge. She carried it back inside, found a small ceramic ink holder on the study desk, filled it with water from the morning jug, and placed the rose in it in the centre of the desk, where the morning light would find it first. She mentioned nothing about this to anyone. She did not leave a note. She simply put the rose where it would be seen and went back to her work, and felt the weight of having done something that could not be entirely explained by any conventional motive. He found it that evening. She knew this because Mrs. Thornton, making the last round of the house before bed, told her that the Duke had remained in his study past 10 o'clock, which was unusual, and that the candle in the window had burned until nearly 11. She offered this as household information, which was all it was. Emiline received it as household information. She thanked her and went upstairs and lay in her narrow servant's bed in the cold north room with the locket in the closed drawer 3 feet from her head, and did not open it. On the 10th morning, Lady Eleanora came to the kitchen garden. This was unexpected. Lady Eleanora walked with a stick, ebony, silver-handled, and had not been observed to take outdoor air since the 2nd day of the visit, when she had pronounced November unconscionable and retired to the warm sitting room with a pot of black tea and the stack of letters she wrote with the productivity of someone correcting the world's ongoing errors. But at 7 o'clock on the 10th morning, she was on the garden path, in a dark coat and a bonnet of beaver felt, moving with the determined pace of a woman who is slower than she used to be and resents every inch of the reduction. Emiline became aware of her approximately at the moment when the old woman became aware of her. She was standing at the corner of the dovecote. She had not meant to stay. She had come to check the water trough, which iced over in heavy frost, and had stayed because the doves, who now associated her with the supplemented grain, had arrived in a white and slate cascade and were arranged along her arms and shoulders in their usual improbable abundance. She stood quite still, as she had learned to stand, and the cold morning air carried the sound of the birds and nothing else. At the other end of the kitchen garden path, 30 yards away, the Duke had come to a complete stop on the flagstones. He was looking at the maid covered in doves, with an expression that Lady Eleanora, watching from the garden gate, had not seen on her nephew's face in 6 years, or perhaps considerably longer. She studied it for a long moment, with the careful attention she had given to the ballroom at the masquerade. The same calculating quality, the same absolute absence of sentimentality. She studied Emiline's height, the way she held her head, the particular quality of stillness that was not timidity, but something closer to its opposite, the stillness of a person who stands in their own weight and does not require the room's permission. Then she turned and made her way back to the house with her ebony stick and her beaver felt bonnet. And the expression she wore was the expression of a woman to whom a complex problem has just revealed its most elegant solution, and who is deciding, with considerable care, exactly when and how to use it. The Duke had still not moved. The doves rose and settled. Emiline looked up from the birds and found him watching her across the bare kitchen garden. And for one suspended moment, neither of them performed anything at all. Not servant, not Duke. Not the correct spatial arrangement of their stations. Just 2 people standing in the cold morning light, with nothing between them but the thin November air and the questions they had not yet asked. Then a bell rang from the kitchen passage. Emiline turned and went inside. And the Duke stood a moment longer on the flagstones before turning also, wearing the face of a man who has understood something he cannot yet decide what to do with. The fortnight had 11 days remaining when Lady Bramwell began to understand that the arrangement she had made was failing in a direction she had not anticipated. She had anticipated one kind of failure, that the Duke, having danced with a masked stranger, would take one clear look at Sophie Bramwell across a breakfast table and feel the acute disappointment of a man whose imagined prize bears no resemblance to its reality. This would have been manageable. Sophie's indifference would have served as confirmation, the fortnight would have expired without incident, and Lady Bramwell could have retreated with her family's dignity intact, and the curate question deferred for another season. This was the failure she had prepared for. The failure that was actually occurring was more complicated and considerably worse. The Duke was not looking at Sophie. He was not ignoring her either. He was too well bred for anything so obvious. But his attention, when Sophie was in the room, had the quality of an attention going through the motions of its own courtesy. He asked her questions about the county and listened to her answers. He offered her the best seat near the fire. He performed, in other words, the exact mechanics of interest without any of its inner life. Whereas in the morning, in the library, Lady Bramwell had seen it once, crossing the passage at 7 o'clock to find Mrs. Thornton about the coals. He was at the hearth, talking to the maid, not in the manner of a man who has accidentally encountered a servant and is managing the encounter, but in the manner of a man who is in the middle of a conversation he was not ready to end, and has forgotten, temporarily, every social protocol that would require him to. Lady Bramwell had stood in the passage for 3 seconds. Then she had turned around and gone back to her room to perform the arithmetic. And the arithmetic this time was not a comfortable exercise. The house party had the usual composition of a fortnight at a country seat in November. Neighbours who came for dinner and stayed, guests who had been invited for shooting and remained after the weather precluded it, a cousin of the Duke's named Mr. Gareth Calloway, who ate very well and said very little, and Lady Catherine Forsyth, who arrived on the 12th day with 2 trunks and a footman of her own, and the particular air of a woman who regards her presence as a corrective measure. Lady Catherine was 40, recently widowed and in possession of a fortune that had belonged to her late husband, and now, by virtue of his having no surviving children and an overly optimistic confidence in his own longevity, belonged entirely to her. She was honey-haired, the honey of late autumn rather than high summer, warm but with an underlying amber, and she wore it dressed with expensive simplicity. Her face had the polished clarity of a woman who has never been in want of a looking-glass. She carried a fan of tortoiseshell and ivory, painted on one side with a hunting scene and on the other with a scene of a hunt's conclusion. And she used it in conversation with a precision that went beyond temperature management. It rose when she wished to be attended to, closed when she wished to punctuate, and tapped against the heel of her gloved hand in a slow, measured rhythm when she was choosing her next move with care. She had expected for 2 years to become the Duchess of Stormhaven. This was not a secret. It was the kind of expectation that counties develop about their best-placed widows, the way counties develop theories about weather, through accumulated evidence, repeated observation, and the confident extrapolation of everyone with no actual access to the subject's intentions. The Duke had not encouraged her, but he had also not, during 6 years of mourning, actively discouraged anyone's expectations. Because actively discouraging expectations required a degree of social energy he had not, in that period, been willing to expend. The county had read his silence as a provisional yes, and Lady Catherine had been among the most optimistic readers. She arrived. She saw the composition of the party. She noted Miss Bramwell's position and Miss Bramwell's demeanour, and assigned both their correct values within 24 hours. She noted the Duke's mornings in the library. She noted, with a faculty for observation that was, in its own way, as precise as Lady Eleanor's, that the maid who read in the library chair was neither apologetic nor hurrying. She noted the roses. A second one had appeared on the study desk by the 14th day, and asked Mrs. Thornton, with the conversational casualness of a woman used to gathering intelligence under social cover, whether the flowers were arranged by the household's florist. Mrs. Thornton said they were seasonal. The forcing house occasionally produced something, even in November. Lady Catherine closed her tortoiseshell fan. The dinner, at which Lady Catherine attempted to resolve the situation in her favour, took place on the 13th evening of the fortnight. The table was set for 14, the house party plus 4 neighbours. The long dining room had been opened for the first time in the visit. It smelled of beeswax and the faint mineral cold of a room recently warmed after long closure, and the candlelight ran the length of a mahogany table broad enough to require 3 epergnes. Emiline was not at the table. She was, as she always was during the dinner service, elsewhere, helping with the serving arrangements in the passage with Hayes, a footman of long farfall service who had the perpetually attentive expression of a man accustomed to carrying information between rooms along with the plates. She learned what she needed from the passage. Lady Catherine had placed herself, with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has conducted many campaigns in dining rooms, at the Duke's right. She had prepared material, the county, a mutual friend in London, a reference to his late wife's family that she introduced at the third course with the apparent carelessness of someone dropping a stone into a pond to watch the circles. What she had prepared for was a certain kind of grief, the grief of a man who has kept his wound accessible, which is the grief that most benefits from proximity and sympathy. What she encountered was a man who listened to her reference to Eleanor's family with the polite, completely closed expression of someone hearing a language they have decided not to translate, and then turned the conversation to the drainage project on the North Field, with a calmness that she had no available counter to. Hayes, refilling the wine at the sideboard, carried the information back to the passage in his face, which required no commentary. Emmeline received it and went back to the linen. Lady Catherine came to find Lady Bramwell the following morning. Emmeline was not present at this conversation, but its results were apparent by the afternoon. She heard a fragment, not through design, but through the domestic accident of a door left 2 inches open at the wrong moment while she was crossing the passage with a water jug. The words she caught were enough. The phrases, "something must be done," and "before the week is out," and "if you care at all for what remains of your position." The voice was Lady Catherine's, and the tone was the tone of a woman who has decided that her own purposes and another person's desperation happen conveniently to align. What happened next did not require Emmeline to have heard anything further. She had lived in houses long enough to read the architecture of a social manoeuvre from its outer walls. By that evening, Hayes told her, with the flat, reportorial effect of a man who distinguishes between gossip and intelligence by its degree of consequence, that he had overheard something at the tea table in the morning room. The precise words, as he conveyed them without emphasis, "They say she reads his books and feeds his doves, and he looks at her as if she were the only woman in the room. A duke and his washerwoman. It is a scandal waiting to happen." This had been said by Lady Catherine to Mrs. Poole, the secretary's wife, in a voice calculated to carry to the 2 other women present, without being traced to its source. Hayes said this, and looked at the floor, and said nothing else. He was 51 years old, and had worked at Farfall since he was 19, and there was a quality to his silence that Emmeline recognised, the silence of a person who has chosen, deliberately, which side of a line to stand on, and is offering the information as a kind of notice of that choice. "Thank you, Hayes," she said. He nodded once and went to lay the hall fire. She considered her position that evening in the narrow servants' room, sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands folded and the single tallow candle burning low. She knew what the rumour was designed to do, to make the Duke's attention toward her seem like her fault, her scheme, her climbing. To place the misbehaviour in her hands, so that dismissing her would feel like housekeeping rather than injustice. She knew what dismissal without a character, at 43, in November, meant in actual material terms. She had always known this. It was one of the fixed points around which her life had organised itself since she was 12 years old. She also knew, and this was newer knowledge, more uncomfortable in its textures, that the rumour was not entirely without foundation. She had not read his books as a scheme. She had not given grain to the doves in order to charm him. She had not placed the rose to manufacture obligation. But she had done all of these things as herself, the actual person she was, when the house gave her sufficient room to be it. And the result was that a man of considerable consequence had begun to see her. Which was, in the architecture of her particular life, precisely the kind of event that was not supposed to happen, and which, when it did happen, had consequences no scheme ever required. The locket was in the drawer. She did not open it. The morning of the 17th day, the last full day of the fortnight, Lady Bramwell came to her room before the household was properly assembled. She stood in the doorway of the servants' room with a quality of compressed decision that told Emiline the deliberating was finished. "The guests will assemble in the long gallery at 11 for the morning visit," she said. "You will present yourself there at 10:30. She paused. "Lady Catherine is accompanying me. We have agreed on the necessary course." Another pause, shorter. "I am sorry for it." It was the only apology Lady Bramwell had ever offered her, and it arrived in the room with an absolute absence of softness. Not because it was insincere, but because the woman who delivered it had not sufficient practice with the form to make it anything other than what it was. A statement of arithmetic, not a comfort. "I understand," Emiline said. She did understand. This was the thing about having lived in houses for 31 years. The mechanisms were legible. The trap was clear. She was to be dismissed publicly, before witnesses, with Lady Catherine present to ensure that the dismissal carried social weight, to make it a judgment about the maid's conduct rather than a revision of Lady Bramwell's scheme. The Duke's regard would be named as its cause. The naming itself would constitute the accusation, and the accusation would render her uncounterable. She was to be made into a cautionary tale in the room where she stood, in front of the people she had quietly served for 17 days. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs for a moment. Then she straightened and began to dress for the morning. And the thing she noticed, without quite expecting it, was that her hands were steady. The long gallery ran the length of Farfal's south face, 80 feet of pale panelled wall, hung with 4 generations of family portraits in frames of gilt and dark oak. The light entered from the south-facing windows, in long horizontal bars that moved across the floor as the morning progressed. And in November, the light was white and level and unsparing. The light that shows all surfaces as they actually are. The house party had gathered there by 10:30. 12 people arranged in the small conversational clusters of a morning visit, teacups in hand, occupying the middle third of the room, while the portraits looked down from both ends with the impartial attention of the long dead. Directly above the fireplace, at the room's west end, hung the largest of the portraits, a full-length painting of a woman in pale blue, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair dressed simply and eyes that looked slightly past the painter at something the painter had not included. Below the painting was written in gilt lettering on a small brass plate attached to the frame: "Eleanor, Duchess of Stormhaven, 1809. 6 years dead." The paint had not cracked. The pale blue dress was as vivid as the day it was laid. The Duke stood near the east windows, speaking to Mr. Calloway about something involving the north drainage. Lady Eleanora occupied a chair near the centre of the room, dressed in black as always, with her garnets at her throat and her ebony stick across her knees. Lady Catherine stood near the fireplace, her tortoiseshell fan open, her face composed in an expression of pleasant attention that had nothing pleasant beneath it. Sophie was at the far window, alone, turned slightly toward the glass. Emiline had taken her position against the wall near the door, the position she always took, the position she had spent 31 years perfecting. Wall to her back, door within reach. The posture of furniture. Lady Bramwell moved to the centre of the room. She did not raise her voice. She had never needed to raise her voice. She had the particular social authority of a woman who knows that a room's attention, once she chooses to claim it, will organise itself accordingly. "I must ask for a moment of your indulgence," she said, with the tone of a woman performing a small but necessary domestic duty. I find that I am obliged to address a matter that reflects on our time here as guests. She let the room settle and quiet. My maid, Emiline, has, during this fortnight, conducted herself in a manner that I must characterise as presumptuous. She has made herself conspicuous to the Duke in ways that are not appropriate to her station. It is with some embarrassment that I must announce that she will leave today, without reference. The room absorbed this. In the specific silence of people receiving social information, they are unsure how to classify. Lady Catherine's fan continued its slow movement. The Duke had turned from the window. Into the silence, Sophie Bramwell spoke. She had risen from the window seat. Her face, when Emiline looked at it, was the face of a young woman who has decided that the cost of silence is higher than the cost of what she is about to say. She was white, not faint, but the particular white of a person in whom fear and decision have arrived simultaneously and reached an impasse that the body registers as cold. "No," Sophie said. Lady Bramwell turned. "You should stop," Sophie said, "before you say more." Her voice was not steady. It shook slightly, with the shaking of someone who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down. But it was clear. It carried. Because what you are saying is not what happened, and the people in this room deserve to hear what actually did. The gallery was very quiet. Emiline felt her own breathing as a fact. Sophie looked at the Duke. She was the only person in the room looking directly at him. Everyone else was looking at Sophie, or at Lady Bramwell, or at their own teacups. She looked at him with the directness of a woman who has nothing to protect because she has already given it up. "The masked woman at your masquerade," she said, "was not me." A beat. 2 beats. The white morning light moved in its slow bar across the floor. My mother arranged it. She sent Emiline in my place, in a gown fitted for me, with a mask to cover her face. Emiline went because she was ordered to, and because refusing would have cost her everything. Sophie's voice had steadied. "The woman you danced with was a servant. She has been serving your household these past 17 days. Everything you found, whatever it was you found, was entirely hers, and none of it was a scheme, and she should not be dismissed for it." A breath. My mother's scheme was the scheme. Emiline had no part in it beyond obedience. She stopped. She sat back down on the window seat as though speech had used the last of her available resource, and she looked at her hands. The gallery remained silent for 3 or 4 seconds, that had the quality of a room in which the air has changed composition. Then the Duke, who had not moved from the east windows since Sophie began speaking, turned. He did not look at Lady Bramwell, or Lady Catherine, or at the portrait of Eleanor above the fireplace, or at any of the 12 people arranged in the morning light of his own gallery. He looked at the wall near the door. He looked at Emiline. She met his gaze. There was nothing else to do. The mask was in the bottom of her box upstairs, and the wall was behind her, and every act of studied invisibility she had performed in 31 years of professional furniturehood had arrived collectively at this one moment in which she could not, by any available technique, be anywhere but exactly where she was. His face went through something. She watched it go through it. A rapid interior sequence that was not merely surprise and not merely recognition, but something that moved faster and deeper than either. He was seeing 2 images simultaneously, the masked woman at the pillar in silver-grey silk, and the maid in the library at 6 in the morning with a cracked Evelyn on her knee. The woman who had said, "You look like a man being measured for a coat he does not want to buy," and the woman who had placed a white rose on his desk without explanation or expectation. He was understanding at this moment that these were the same person, and that the same person was standing against the wall in grey wool, her hands at her sides, her face carrying no expression it had not earned. "It was you," he said. Not an accusation, not a question. A recognition. The kind that arrives not as news, but as the confirmation of something the body already knew, and which the mind has only now been given sufficient information to name. Emiline held his gaze and said nothing. There was, at this moment, nothing accurate to say. The gallery held its breath around them. Lady Catherine motionless, fan arrested in mid-movement. Lady Eleanora's old, sharp eyes moving between her nephew's face and the woman by the door. Sophie at the window seat with her hands still folded. Lady Bramwell frozen at the room's centre, with the expression of a woman whose arithmetic has produced a result she had not included in her calculations. The morning light fell across the gallery floor. The portrait of Eleanor above the fireplace looked slightly past all of them, at something no one else could see. And in the quiet that followed the Duke's 3 words, the absolute, suspended, combustible quiet of a room waiting to discover what happens next, the only sound was the faint percussion of Lady Catherine's tortoiseshell fan, resuming, very slowly, its measured beat against the heel of her gloved hand. The gallery held its position for 3 seconds more. Then Mr. Gareth Calloway, who had spent the fortnight saying very little, set his teacup down on the nearest surface with a care that suggested he was removing it from the field of any foreseeable development. It was a small act. A teacup, a shelf, a deliberate placement. But it moved something in the room. The way a single stone moved into still water moves everything. Lady Catherine's fan resumed. The white morning light travelled its slow bar across the floor. Someone near the door, one of the house party wives, a Mrs. Ellsworth, drew a single soft breath that she immediately suppressed. Lady Bramwell, in the centre of the room, had gone the particular colour of a woman in whom authority and catastrophe have arrived simultaneously and produced a kind of mutual cancellation. Not rage, not collapse, but a blank, suspension. The brief shutdown of a mechanism overtaxed beyond its tolerance. She stood very still, and Emmeline understood, watching her across the room, that what was happening in Lady Bramwell's face was not a performance, but a genuine reckoning. The specific quality of a woman confronting the arithmetic she has refused to do until the numbers are undeniable. Emmeline did not wait to be dismissed a second time. She moved from the wall, not toward the door, toward the centre of the room, which required a kind of deliberateness that she felt in every step, but did not permit herself to examine. She stopped within reasonable speaking distance of the assembled company, and looked at no particular person, and spoke to all of them. "Miss Bramwell has told you the truth," she said. "I went to the masquerade as instructed, and came back as instructed, and I have been in this house these past 17 days, as I have been in every house for 30 years, doing my work. If any of what I did here gave offence, I am sorry for it. But I am not sorry for what I am, and I will not make a speech of apology for reading a book or speaking honestly when spoken to." She let a brief pause settle that. "I will go. I only ask the time to pack my box." She turned toward the door. "No." The Duke's voice arrived in the room with the quality of a word that has been held in reserve for exactly this moment, and is not, in its delivery, particularly loud, but carries a density that precludes being spoken over. He had moved from the east windows while she was speaking, crossed a third of the gallery's length in the time it took her to say what she had said, and he was now between her and the door, not blocking it, standing before it the way a person stands when they have placed themselves in a position not to prevent a departure, but to be the last thing seen before it. He said, "I would like you to stop." And then, because the room was still there, and because the room required it, and because the Duke of Stormhaven was a man who had lived the last 6 years inside a careful silence that had not, as it turned out, been mourning so much as waiting, he turned to the assembled company and kept his hand extended toward Emiline and spoke. "I danced with this woman at the masquerade, and I did not know who she was, and it did not matter. I spent a fortnight in this house talking with her at dawn, and I knew very well who she was, and it did not matter then either." He paused. The light caught the grey at his temples, the worn severity of his face. "I will marry her if she will have me. I ask her here and not in private because she has been manoeuvred too many times already by private arrangements, and I will not be another one." He looked at Emiline. "I am asking in front of every person in this room so that there is no version of the story in which this is a scheme of hers. It is mine. It is entirely, specifically mine." The gallery received this. Sophie at the window put her face in her hands, not with distress, but with the gesture of someone to whom something has arrived that is larger than the available expression. From the fireplace, Lady Catherine rose. She rose with the fluid, controlled motion of a woman who has prepared for precisely this contingency and has decided that the prepared response is the correct one. She was white. Not the cold white of shock, but the particular white of a person in whom fury has reached a temperature that bleaches rather than flushes. Her fan was closed. Her chin was lifted. "I shall leave this afternoon," she said, "into the room rather than to any specific member of it. And I shall not be alone in finding this episode," a pause with the weight of a door closing, "remarkable. The county will hear of it. I can promise that." The silence after this was of the kind that forms when a weapon has been deployed and the room is deciding whether to flinch. Lady Eleanor's voice came from the chair at the room's centre. "Sit down, Catherine." It was not a request. Lady Eleanor did not phrase requests in the manner of requests. At 81, having outlived 2 husbands, a son, and the better part of her patience with social theatre, she had arrived at a point where her voice simply carried what it needed to carry and relied on the clarity of its own authority. She had not raised it. She had not altered her position in the gilt chair. She was looking at Lady Catherine with the expression of a woman who has seen a great many people attempt to leave rooms dramatically, and who finds the manoeuvre neither impressive nor alarming. "Sit down, before you make yourself more ridiculous than you already are. The Duke's choice is his own, and I, for one, intend to stand by it." The garnets at her throat caught the light as she turned slightly to include the room. As will, I suspect, any person here with the wit to recognise when something actual is occurring. Lady Catherine stood for 2 more seconds. The 2 seconds of a woman deciding whether a strategic retreat can be performed in a way that saves its essential face. Then she sat. The fan remained closed on her lap. Her expression settled into something that was not acceptance, but was, at least, a temporary cessation of advance. Mr. Calloway picked up his teacup. Mrs. Ellsworth found in her hands the cup she had apparently been holding throughout, and took a sip of it. The room began by slow degrees, the work of reassembling itself around a new arrangement of facts. Emiline was still near the door. The Duke was still between her and it. He was looking at her with the patient, unperformed quality of a man who has said what he needed to say, and is prepared to wait as long as the situation requires for the answer. His extended hand had lowered slightly, not withdrawn, but resting, an offer rather than a claim. "I would like one day," she said. "You may have whatever you require. One day. Not because I am uncertain of you." She looked at him steadily. "Because I want to be certain of myself. He gave a single nod. The compact was made with the same compressed economy as everything he did, she had learned, in 17 mornings, that he expressed finality in small movements rather than large ones. She left the gallery. Hayes, who had been standing in the passage with a cloth he was not using, looked at the floor when she passed. She did not fault him for it. A person could not look at everything at once. She walked down the passage, past the library door, past the small study where the ledgers stood, and up the back stairs to the north servants' room. And she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed her palms flat on her thighs, and stayed there until the trembling, which she had not been going to permit herself in the gallery, and which was now insisting upon its rights, passed. Outside the window, the kitchen garden was bare and still. The dovecote at its north end stood quiet in the grey morning. The doves, disturbed by something, a cat on the kitchen garden wall, or simply the specific atmospheric pressure of a day that has been through more than days usually manage, moved in brief white circuits above the hexagonal turret and settled. Sophie found her at noon. She came to the north room with no particular pretence of errand, which was new. Sophie had always announced herself with errands, had always offered an object as a social excuse for presence, as though the presence itself required justification. She sat in the single chair by the dormer window and looked at Emiline on the bed and said, "Adair had a letter this morning. The living is confirmed. His patron wrote last week." Emiline looked at her. "I'm telling you," Sophie said, "because you need to know that your answer has no bearing on mine. Whatever happens here, my situation has resolved itself." She was quiet for a moment. "You gave up a year of your life to protect mine. I wanted you to know that it was not wasted." "It wasn't a year," Emiline said. "The masquerade and the fortnight and everything before it that you kept silent about." Sophie folded her hands in her lap, with the careful deliberateness of a young woman organising her conviction. "It was yours to spend as you chose. But I wanted to say it plainly. It was not wasted." They sat for a while in the north room, with the winter light moving through the dormer window across the floor between them. Sophie did not say anything else that required answering. She stayed for perhaps 20 minutes and then went downstairs, and the room was quiet again, and different for the having been less so. Lady Eleanora came at 3 o'clock. She came alone and unannounced, which Emiline suspected was the only way Lady Eleanora went anywhere. The woman had the distinct air of someone for whom the concept of a herald would represent an insupportable redundancy. She entered the north room with her ebony stick and her beaver felt bonnet, which she had not removed, and looked around the space with a brief, taking inventory quality that was not unkind, but was entirely unsparing. 8 by 10, she said. "Yes. I had a room smaller than this when I was first married. Different circumstances, but the same principle, that a woman's actual dimensions are irrelevant to the size of the space allotted to her." She settled into the chair Sophie had vacated, with the careful weight distribution of a woman whose joints register protest, but whose will does not acknowledge it. "Sit down." Emiline sat. Lady Eleanora opened her reticule, a small black silk affair of obvious age, the drawstring worn soft with decades of use, and removed a folded paper. She set it on the dormer windowsill between them, with the practiced ease of a woman who has conducted several serious transactions in her life, and considers the folded paper stage the least interesting part of them. "That is an annuity," she said, "settled on you personally, from my own funds, which are separate from my nephew's and will remain so. It is small, £60 per annum, but it is unconditional and irrevocable, and it will exist regardless of what you decide this evening, or at any future point." She looked at Emiline with her old, sharp, entirely unsentimental eyes. "I am not offering it as an inducement. I am offering it because I watched you in this house for 17 days and I watched you in my nephew's ballroom before any of this, and I know the difference between a woman making a choice and a woman with no available alternative. I want you to have an alternative." Emiline looked at the folded paper on the windowsill. It was cream-coloured, good quality, written in a hand she did not recognise. A solicitor's hand, she thought, measured and precise. Her name was on it, her actual name, written in full at the top. Emiline Margaret Kelmont. "You arranged this before today," she said. "I arranged it on the 9th day of the visit," Lady Eleanora said, without particular inflection. "When I saw my nephew standing in the kitchen garden looking at a maidservant covered in doves, as though the sun had just risen in the wrong direction, and I recognised in his face something I had not seen there in many years, and I decided that if this situation was going where I believed it to be going, it would not go with a woman who had no independent ground to stand on." She picked up her stick. "I have been a woman with no independent ground. I remember the quality of decisions made from that position." Emiline reached out and picked up the paper. It had the specific weight of documents that have legal force. Slight more than blank paper. The difference being the density of consequence. She held it without reading it further. She had read her name at the top, and that was enough for the present. The rest she would read later, when she had time to read it with the attention it deserved. "Thank you," she said. Lady Eleanora rose. "Don't thank me for £60 a year." She paused at the door with her hand on the frame, not leaning, not uncertain, but simply pausing, as a woman pauses who has one further thing to say and is choosing the exact form of it. "He has been alone in this house for 6 years, which is at least 4 years longer than was good for him. He is better for the last 17 days than he has been in any of those 6 years. And both of us know why." The old eyes met hers, direct and without indirection of any kind. "The county will talk. I have lived in this county for 61 years, and I can tell you with authority that it talks about everything and survives everything it talks about. That is not your concern. Your concern is whether you want the life." She tapped the doorframe once with the ebony stick in a gesture that seemed to conclude something, and left. Emiline held the annuity paper on her knee for a long time. The north room held what remained of the afternoon light. Thin, cold, the light of a day burning toward its short November close. The dovecote at the bottom of the kitchen garden was in shadow now. The doves had gone in. In the library below, someone, she heard the footstep pattern, recognised it, was pacing the length of the room in the quiet, repetitive way of a man who is not reading, and is not leaving, and is not sure what to do with the interval between an offer made and an answer not yet given. She held the paper and listened to the pacing. £60 per annum. Her name written in a solicitor's hand. The weight of a document that said, "You may choose." She folded the annuity along its original creases and placed it in the drawer of the night table next to the locket, and they lay there together, the old and the new, the closed and the open, the thing she had preserved for 30 years, and the thing she had been given today, in a north room that smelt of cold stone and tallow, and the particular mineral honesty of a life stripped of all its comfortable imprecision. Outside, the kitchen garden was losing its detail to the dusk. The pale flagstones went grey, then the grey of the pathway gravel went dark, and the bare earth of the beds became indistinguishable from the November sky. The dovecote's hexagonal turret was a black shape against the last of the light. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dimming room and waited. And the house settled around her. The fire sounds below, the distant movement of the supper preparations in the kitchen, the large, patient, waking silence of a place learning again what it means to be inhabited. And somewhere in the dark garden below the window, a footstep moved on the kitchen path. He knocked, not on the servant's door at the base of the stairwell, not through Hayes or Mrs. Thornton with a message folded on the silver tray. He knocked on the door of the north room itself, 3 quiet raps, and waited. Emiline opened it. He was in his coat still, the dark coat he had worn to the gallery that morning. Not changed for dinner, which told her something about the quality of his afternoon. He was not carrying anything. His hands were at his sides. He looked like a man who has rehearsed several opening sentences and arrived at the door having decided against all of them, which left him standing in the passage in the particular honesty of someone with nothing prepared. "I said one day," she said. "It is past 7 o'clock," he said. "I have been arguing with myself about whether the end of the afternoon constitutes a day for approximately 4 hours, and I have concluded that it does not, and that I am here regardless." He paused. "May I come in?" She stepped back from the door. He entered the north room and looked at it. The 8 by 10 of it, the sloping ceiling, the single chair, the dormer window now dark, with the same unsparing attention Lady Eleanora had given it, but carrying something additional. The expression was not pity. It was closer to the expression of a man standing in the evidence of a fact he has known abstractly and is now understanding in its actual dimensions. He did not comment on it. He turned to face her. "I want to tell you something before I ask again," he said. "Not as a persuasion, as an account." She waited. The tallow candle on the night table, she had lit it at 6 when the room went dark, made the only light in the room, and it was the kind of light that removed social distance from its surroundings the way cold removes pretense, by making everything smaller and more immediate and more true. "I spent 6 years in this house being careful," he said. "After Eleanor died, not only grieving, though I did that, but being careful. Careful with the estate, careful with the county, careful with what I allowed myself to want. Because wanting things, in my experience, had produced a marriage that was not unkind, not unhappy in the ordinary way, but not—" He stopped. He looked at the window where the dark garden was now invisible. "I did not love her as she deserved, and I knew it, and she knew it, and we managed. She was a generous woman, but the experience produced in me a strong conviction that wanting things incautiously was dangerous, and that the correct response was to want very little and to manage that little with great precision." He looked back at her. "And then a woman at a pillar told me I looked like a man being measured for a coat he did not want to buy. And I found myself talking for an hour without managing anything at all." The candle flame moved in the draught from the sloping ceiling. The dovecote outside the dark window held its silence. "I am not a young man," he continued. "I have an estate that spent 6 years losing its warmth by degrees, and a county that will talk about this until something more interesting presents itself, which may take several years. I have an aunt who has already settled £60 a year on you without consulting me, which I find I am not annoyed by in the way I perhaps should be, because it is exactly what she should have done." A brief compression of the mouth that was, unmistakably now, a smile, small but entirely real. "What I have that is worth offering is the house and the library and the doves and the honest fact that I have not wanted anything incautiously in 6 years until 17 days ago, when I apparently lost the habit entirely." He extended his hand, not as a summons, as an offer of exactly the weight Lady Eleanora had calibrated the annuity to allow her to accept freely. Emiline looked at his hand, and then at his face, and she had known since the kitchen garden, if she was being accurate about it. She had known in the waltz, in the 4 minutes of the waltz. But knowing a thing and standing in the room with it are different propositions. And she had needed the interval. She had needed the north room and the annuity paper and the afternoon's pacing audible through the library floor, and the specific quality of a day that had given her time to understand that what she was about to choose was not a rescue, and not a resolution, but a beginning, which was harder and more serious than either. She took his hand. He closed his fingers around hers with the same steadiness as the waltz, present, entirely, in this specific moment, not managing it towards some subsequent arrangement, but simply in it. She felt the warmth of his hand in the cold north room and said nothing. And he said nothing. And the candle flame steadied in the draught as though it had found, finally, the angle at which it intended to burn. Yes, she said. It was one word, but it was hers. Bought with £60 a year and 31 years of practice at telling the truth in the spaces where she was permitted to. And it arrived in the room with the weight of a word that has been earned. They married in February, in the small church at the edge of the Farfall estate. A church of old stone with a nave that held 20 people comfortably and 30 at a press, which was exactly the number that attended. Mrs. Thornton was there, in her second-best coat, with a bunch of hothouse violets she had grown herself in the recovered forcing house. Hayes stood at the back and looked at the floor throughout, in the manner of a man managing a large private feeling through the technique of concentrated flooring. Jeb did not come to the church, but in the morning when the household stirred, he had left a bunch of dried lavender tied with white string on the kitchen doorstep, which Mrs. Thornton found and brought in without comment, and which Emiline kept. Sophie married Mr. Adair in March. She came to Farfall for a week in April with her husband, a slight, fair-faced young man who wore his clerical collar with the air of someone for whom it was a genuine statement rather than a professional costume. And she walked the kitchen garden with Emiline on the morning of her second day, in the rain, with no particular purpose. The spring had come early. The forcing house was producing in earnest now, and Jeb had taken on a boy from the village to assist him, a decision he communicated not verbally, but by the simple fact of the boy's appearing one morning beside him at the cote. The beds were turned and planted. The walnut grove on the east slope, which had stood dark and leafless through the winter, had produced, in the wet April warmth, the first green of an honest spring. She would have liked you, Sophie said, at the kitchen garden wall looking at the grove. Eleanor? I only saw her once, when I was very small, but she had the look of someone who noticed things. Sophie turned up the collar of her coat against the rain. She would have noticed you. Emiline said nothing. She looked at the grove, at the new leaves moving in the rain. 40 years old, planted for strangers, arriving now in the keeping of a woman the planter could not have imagined. Lady Bramwell went to Bath in March, and then to her sister in Edinburgh, and wrote, from Edinburgh, a letter to Emiline that was 3 paragraphs long, and did not contain an apology, but contained something that functioned, in the architecture of Lady Bramwell's particular character, as the nearest available equivalent. A statement that the affairs of Emiline Kelmont had resolved themselves in a manner she had not anticipated, and which she acknowledged to be, on balance, appropriate. This was as generous as Lady Bramwell was built to be, and Emiline received it in the spirit it was offered and wrote back a letter of 2 paragraphs that did not mention the road, or the winter, or the morning room, or anything that had been said in it, and they maintained thereafter a correspondence that was formal and regular and served its purpose. Lady Catherine left the county for London in late February and remained there. The county talked about the marriage until June, at which point a perfectly adequate new scandal arrived from the next parish and redirected the available commentary. Lady Eleanora had predicted this with the accuracy of a woman who has been predicting counties for 6 decades, and she said nothing further on the subject beyond a single letter to her nephew in March that read, "I told you so," in the manner of someone confirming a calculation, followed by 3 paragraphs about the new drainage project and a postscript asking whether Emiline had considered a kitchen garden extension to the south. She had. The extension was begun in May. It was July before the east wing was opened. Not all of it. There were rooms that would take another season. Rooms whose contents required sorting through in ways that needed time and care and the particular courage of a man confronting his own history, one room at a time. But the east drawing room, at the corner where the morning light entered from two directions and fell across the pale carpet in a pattern that changed with the hour, was unshuttered and aired, and its furniture uncovered in the first week of July. Mrs. Thornton supervised the uncovering with the expression of a woman restoring something that was always meant to be found. The room was light. The floor-to-ceiling windows faced the kitchen garden on one side and the walnut grove on the other, and in the July morning the light was the specific warm gold of a summer that has followed a winter that was worth following. The roses from the forcing house had been moved to beds along the east wall of the garden in April, and they were flowering now, white, abundantly against the stone. The Duke found Emiline in the library on a Tuesday morning in late July, in the window chair with the morning light at the angle she preferred, reading a copy of Gilpin's Observations on the River Wye that she had found in the section on household management, which was where his grandmother, it seemed, had filed everything she considered essential. He brought 2 cups of coffee from the sideboard, as he always did, and settled into the chair at the other end of the hearth, and opened his own book, and the library held its warm, settled, working quiet, the kind that belongs to rooms used by 2 people who have found their correct arrangement. Above the east window, where they had decided together to hang it, the grey silk domino mask caught the morning light, the silver thread of its border tracing its small, repeating pattern of knots along the edge, pewter against grey, the needlework precise and unhurried as the work of someone who made things to last. The mask did not cover anything now. It hung in the window light of the waking house and said what it had always, underneath everything, been saying: that there was a woman here, and she had been seen.